I have served on the Concord's classification panel for 31 years. In that time, I have reviewed 412 species assessments. I have signed off on 297 standard protections, 68 quarantine designations, 12 controlled contact frameworks, and 9 involuntary restriction orders. Those last being reserved for species whose behavioral profiles suggested active danger to established members of the Concord community. I have issued 4 extinctions by committee, all of them recommended by the Senior Scientific Corps and ratified by a full chamber vote, not by me alone. I note this not as pride but as context. I am not an arbiter who flinches at difficult conclusions. I have read things that would have sent a younger bureaucrat to the reintegration suites. I had never, before the morning I am about to describe, requested a recess in the middle of a review session. I had never asked the recorder to pause the transcript log. I had never sat alone in the consultation alcove off chamber Orphle 3 with a document ted on actual material. Not a projection, not a holographic render, but a physical reproduction requested specifically because I wanted to feel the weight of it in my hands. And read the same 12 pages 4 times, while the station's ventilation cycling was the only sound I could hear. I'm describing that moment because it is where this record properly begins, though the formal hearing started nearly 6 hours earlier. The session had been scheduled as a routine reclassification review. That designation, in Concord administrative language, means something specific. A species already cataloged, a prior protective status already assigned, and a triggering event, usually a border incident, a first contact complication, or newly surfaced intelligence, that warrants a second look before the original classification is confirmed or revised. We handle several of these a month. They are, as a rule, unremarkable. The species in question either holds its prior rating without difficulty, gets a marginal adjustment, or in rare cases gets escalated to a full chamber for broader deliberation. Entry 7, 441H had been flagged for reclassification following a border incident in the Keth Vos buffer zone 3 years prior. A Sauric commercial hauler designated the Orth's Sen had made an unplanned stop at a way station inside the buffer, a mechanical stop, fully documented, nothing irregular, and had, during a 6-hour resupply window, been in proximity to a human vessel also docked for resupply at the same station. No contact had been established between the crews. No incident had occurred. What had happened was that the Orth Sen's environmental monitoring system, running its routine sweep, passively captured an audio feed from the adjacent docking berth. Not deliberately, not through any act of intelligence collection, simply because the human vessel's external communication port had been left open in a way that allowed ambient transmission to bleed. The audio was approximately 40 minutes of conversation between what appeared to be 2 or 3 human individuals. The content of that conversation was what generated the flag. I am going to describe the content of the audio briefly because it is relevant context and because the intake office had included a summary of it at the end of the preliminary intake summary, which I had twice on the transit and which I had found, at that point, more puzzling than alarming. The puzzlement is itself interesting to document. The humans in the audio recording were discussing a competition. Not in abstract terms, they were discussing it with the specific, technical familiarity of people for whom the competition was a professional context they moved through regularly. They discussed vehicles. They discussed routes. They discussed what appeared, from context, to be other competitors, referring to them by what seemed to be names or designations and discussing their respective tactical tendencies and weaknesses with the same matter-of-fact analytical register that any professional might use when discussing colleagues. The flag was generated by a specific exchange in the recording of the humans were discussing what happened when a third competitor, referred to by name, had been eliminated in a previous heat. The discussion was not, as best the xenographic office could assess, distressed. It was not celebratory in a way that suggested cruelty or particular hatred. It was analytical. One of the humans said something about the technical approach used in the elimination and described it as clean, with what appeared to be professional approval. The other human made a comment about timing. The first human responded that the timing was the hard part. and expressed what appeared to be genuine respect for the person who had executed it, and then noted that the same approach would probably be used against them in a later heat, and they should think about a countermeasure. The xenographic office had translated clean as indicating quality or skillful execution. They had noted in their summary that the term appeared to be used in the same way it is used in lethality craft assessment, as a marker of technical excellence. The thing being assessed as excellent was the technical execution of killing another person in a vehicle race. The intake officer who had written the preliminary summary, a junior assessor I had not personally worked with, had noted the flag in precise, professional language and had indicated that the content of the audio suggested the humans might be involved in regulated lethal competition as a professional occupation. The junior assessor had phrased this with the slight uncertainty of a person who was not sure whether they were describing something real or had made a translation error. I had read the summary on the transcript and thought, this will require verification. I had not thought, this will require me to sit alone in a consultation alcove for 22 minutes. I was wrong about that. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll start at the beginning of the session because the sequence matters. The way the picture assembled itself, piece by piece, over the course of that morning, that is itself something worth documenting. Assessor Peth Rall arrived first as she usually does. Peth Rall is Sauric, which means she has the characteristic stillness of her species, a physical quality that reads to most non-Sauric observers as either great patience or mild sedation. It is neither. Sauric cognition simply processes faster than Sauric expression, which means a Sauric assessor who appears to be quietly waiting is usually 3 analytical steps ahead of everyone else in the room and choosing not to say so yet. In 30, I have found this extremely useful. Peth Rall had been on my panel for 11 of those years and I trusted her, judgment above most. Recorder Isabel 7 was already at the bench as always. Isabel 7 is Veth Khan, the only Veth Khan on staff at Chamber Orval 3, which is an accident of assignment and not a reflection of Veth Khan interest in Concord administration. There are, I'm told, quite a few Veth Khan in the Eastern classification offices. Isabel 7 handles all transcript archiving, exhibits management, and the technical maintenance of the chamber's display systems. She is meticulous. She once flagged a transcription error in a 200-page hearing record because a single possessive marker had been rendered ambiguous in the 7th exhibit, a grammatical issue with no bearing on the outcome of the case. She flagged it anyway. I respect this. I came in last, set my working file on the senior arbiter's station, and looked at the preliminary summary that had been prepared by the intake office. Entry 7441H, species, human, homeworld, Earth, 3rd orbital position, inner system, Sol, a single-star yellow dwarf in the outer arm of the galaxy's primary, spiraling structure. Prior classification, provisional standard protection, Category 3, assigned at the time of first cataloging, roughly 60 standard years ago, on the basis of a preliminary survey that had assessed the species as tool, using organized language capable, and exhibiting early-stage interstellar reach. Category 3, Provisional Standard Protection, is the default assignment for emerging species showing 4 markers. It essentially says we see you, we won't touch you, re-examine in 50 years. The re-examination had been delayed by administrative backlog, and then flagged upward when the border incident occurred. The intake summary was 4 pages. I had read it twice on the transit to the station. It told me relatively little that I found surprising. The humans had, in the 60 years since their original cataloging, expanded their interstellar presence considerably. Not to any degree that them into formal conflict with established Concord members, but enough that the buffer zones had required periodic adjustment. There had been 2 prior low-level incidents, both involving navigation disputes at contested way station access points, both resolved through standard diplomatic channels before they required Concord intervention. The species had not contacted the Concord directly, which is not unusual for a Category 3 provisional. Most species at that developmental stage are either unaware of the Concord's existence or aware of it in a vague, mythological way that doesn't prompt formal outreach. I noted that the humans had what appeared to be functioning governance structures. Multiple of them, in fact, is itself an interesting data point I'll return to. They had international coordination bodies, trade frameworks, conflict resolution protocols. The usual architecture of a species that has recognized the advantages of not being constantly at war with itself, or at least of keeping its wars sufficiently structured that civilization survives them. I noted this in the margin without particular emphasis. It was unremarkable at the time. The first exhibit was the Combat Assessment Package. This is standard in reclassification reviews that involve border incidents. We pull whatever military or conflict data is available and have it, formatted for tribunal review. The data for 7041 had been assembled from 3 sources. Passive sensor records from the Keth-Voss buffer zone going back 40 years. Intelligence summary reports compiled by the Zurich Territorial Assessment Directorate, following the 2 prior navigation disputes, and a set of historical military records that the Concord's own xenographic office had compiled from human open-source transmission archives. The humans, it turns out, had been broadcasting enormous quantities of historical information into open-frequency space for decades, apparently without any particular security concern about who might be receiving it. The humans were, by every measurable metric, extraordinarily violent. I want to be precise about this, because violent is a word that gets applied to a lot of species in these reviews, and it is not always meaningful. Many species exhibit violence as a stress response. Many exhibit it as a territorial behavior that diminishes with resource stability. Many exhibit it in structured, actual forms that serve specific social functions, and don't generalize to actual threat to others profiles. The Lethality, my own species, had what our own xenographic historians classify as an extreme violence period lasting approximately 800 years, during which our recorded mortality from intraspecies conflict was staggering. We outgrew it, or rather, we structured our way out of it. We built institutions that redirected the underlying competitive drives into forms that didn't consume as many lives. This is historically what sentient species tend to do. The humans had not, by the time of the original cataloging 60 years ago, done this particularly successfully. The human military record was extensive and detailed, and showed a species that had been fighting sustained, organized, industrialized conflict across most of its documented history. The scale was notable. The lethality figures were notable. What I found most notable, reading through the combat assessment, was a specific subcategory in the intelligence summary, a column labeled, in the standard assessment format, Tactical Behavior Profile. The Zurich Territorial Assessment Directorate rated species on a behavioral axis that runs from instinct-governed on one end to deliberate adaptive on the other. Instinct-governed means the combat behavior is primarily driven by threat response. The animal fights because it perceives danger, and the fighting behavior is relatively stereotyped, relatively predictable, and self-limiting once the threat perception resolves. Deliberate adaptive means the species thinks about how to fight. It learns, it innovates, it applies accumulated knowledge to new tactical problems, and it continues fighting beyond the point where simple threat response would have disengaged. The humans were rated deliberate adaptive at the absolute far end of the scale, not slightly, emphatically, TOS. The Zurich analysts had included a note at the bottom of the column that I had to read twice. The species shows no observed ceiling on tactical adaptation. No instance of tactical stagnation has been identified in the documented record. The species has never, in any reviewed conflict period, been observed to stop innovating. It either wins, loses while still innovating, or loses while having already seeded the innovations it was developing into successor groups that continue them. Peth Rall looked up from her station when I finished reading that page. She didn't say anything. She simply looked at me with the particular quality of stillness that after 11 years I had learned to read as, "I have seen the same thing you just saw, and I agree it is worth pausing on." I made a note. I moved to the next section of the assessment. The lethality figures themselves. I'll summarize rather than reproduce in full, because they are extensive. Across a 600-year documented conflict record, this being the period for which the humans' own broadcast archives provided sufficient detail, the number of human deaths attributable to intraspecies conflict runs to an order of magnitude that I found genuinely difficult to process without stopping to verify the decimal placement in the conversion table. I verified it 3 times. The number was correct. More to the point, the species was still there. After all of that, the species was still there, had in fact expanded in population, technological capability, territorial reach during the same period. This is not typical. Most species that sustain intraspecies conflict at that scale and that duration either reach a stable reduced equilibrium or extinguish themselves. The humans had done neither. They had continued. I made a second note. The combat assessment section was closing toward a recommendation of Category 6. Controlled contact with monitoring, which is the designation for species whose lethality profile is high enough to warrant formal protocols. Before any Concord member engages with them directly, Category 6 is not a quarantine. It's not a restriction. It simply means we treat this species as if they know how to fight, because they clearly do, and we ensure that any member who encounters them has been formally briefed on that fact. It is a precautionary designation, not a hostile one. I had Category 6 in my draft notes. I thought it was probably correct. I thought we would confirm it, write the report, close the file. Then Isabel 7 presented Exhibit B. She brought it up on the chamber display without preamble, the way she always does. Isabel 7 does not narrate her exhibits, she simply makes them available, on the grounds that the panel is capable of reading. I have always appreciated this. She put Exhibit B on the left half of the display, and the translation key on the right. Because the document was in the human language designated Primary 7 in the Xenographic Catalog. One of several hundred human languages, this one the most commonly transmitted in the open source broadcast archive. The document header, in translation, read, Official Governing Charter and Competition Rules. Sanction 7 Death Race Series. Ratified by the governing authority of the Federal Wasteland. Administration, current edition. I looked at it for a moment. I looked at Pethral. Pethral had gone entirely still. I said, to no one in particular, where did this come from? Isabel 7, still not looking up from her bench. It was recovered from the Orith Sen audio capture. The audio feed included what appears to have been a document transmission. The human vessel's external port had been left open for outgoing data as well as incoming. The transmission was partially degraded. The Xenographic Office recovered approximately 83% of the original document. Portions not recovered are indicated with gray field placeholders in the exhibit. I said, Isabel 7 said, Arbiter, I believe the document describes itself. She was right, it did. I am going to take some time here. This is the exhibit that is most relevant to the question of why the classification file is not closed. I'm going to describe the document in some detail, because I think the detail is the point. The official governing charter and competition rules of what the document referred to as the Sanction 7 Death Race Series was, in form and structure, a regulatory document, not a propaganda document, not a military doctrine, a regulatory document. The kind of instrument that governing bodies produce when they want to define the parameters of an activity, establish consistent enforcement standards, protect the rights of participants, and provide a mechanism for dispute resolution. Document opened with a preamble. The preamble describes the purpose of the competition series and the authority under which it was established. I will summarize the preamble. A governing administrative body called the Federal Land Administration had established a series of competitive events in which multiple teams or individuals would participate. The nature of the competition involved vehicles. The vehicle operators would traverse a designated course. The document made clear, in language that I will describe as matter-of-fact rather than inflammatory, that competing participants were expected to die during the events, not as an accident of the competition, and not as a theoretical risk, as an anticipated and regularly occurring feature of participation. Mortality of competitors was described in the preamble as a natural consequence of competition at sanctioned intensity levels, and was explicitly acknowledged by the governing body as something that had occurred, did occur, and was expected to continue occurring. Preamble then stated the administrative body's commitment to ensuring that competition mortality occurred within a framework of fair and consistently applied rules. I want to underline that sentence. The commitment was to fairness, to consistency, not to prevention. Prevention was not a stated goal. The stated goal was governance of something that was going to happen regardless. I said, aloud to Pethral. They wrote a sportsmanship code. Pethral said, keep reading. I kept reading. The document was organized into 12 articles. I will walk through the relevant ones. Article 1 established the jurisdiction and authority of the governing body. It described the Federal Wasteland Administration as a lawful and recognized governing authority, operating within a specified territorial range, noted that the competition series fell under its exclusive regulatory jurisdiction. This was not, I want to be clear, a document produced by a fringe element or a criminal enterprise. It was produced by an entity that described itself as, and appeared to be, an arm of government. The jurisdictional language was careful and internally consistent in the way that language produced by lawyers and administrators is careful and consistent. The same quality you find in Concord Charter documents, in Zurich trade agreements, in lethality territorial protocols. Article 2 defined the competition structure. There were multiple heats. There was a point system. Points were awarded for finishing position, for completing course segments in a specified time, and this is the part where I had to pause, for specific acts of competitive elimination. The term used in the document was verified elimination of a competing vehicle. Each verified elimination was worth a stated number of points. There were bonus point multipliers for eliminations achieved by specified methods, described in a subtable that I will not reproduce in full, but that covered, in clinical and specific language, a range of techniques for destroying another vehicle with its operator inside. The subtable read, in translation, like a pricing schedule. I want to linger on the subtable, because it is worth examining in some detail. The methods described were organized into categories. The document used its own internal category system, which the xenographic translators had rendered faithfully. One category covered what the document called environmental eliminations, meaning eliminations achieved by directing a competing vehicle into a terrain feature, a structural hazard, or a boundary condition. These received a standard point value. A second category covered what the document called direct eliminations, meaning eliminations achieved, direct vehicle-to-vehicle contact resulting in the destruction or incapacitation of the target vehicle. These received a higher point value. Third category, which received the highest point value of all, was labeled in the document as contested eliminations. The document's definition of this category described it as an elimination achieved against a competitor who was actively attempting to eliminate the eliminating competitor. Simultaneously, mutual threat engagement, in other words, both parties trying to kill each other, and one succeeding. Premium on contested eliminations was not trivial. It was substantial. The document valued the mutual threat scenario considerably more highly than the others. This was not, the document's own framing suggested, arbitrary. The note accompanying the point premium read, in translation, contested eliminations reflect the highest level of competitive engagement and are awarded proportionally in recognition of the risk accepted by the successful competitor. The document was assigning value to risk accepted. It was, in its own internal logic, rewarding courage. In a lethal competition. With points, Pethral said very quietly, there's a tiebreaker condition. There was, Article 2, Section 7. In the event of equal point totals at the conclusion of a heat, the tie would be resolved by a secondary metric. The document's term translated as most technically proficient elimination, with proficiency defined by a criterion that I read twice to make sure I had the translation correct. It was not about force or speed or simple destructiveness. It was about what the document called execution quality, which was elaborated in the accompanying criterion text as a combination of timing precision, tactical setup, minimal collateral interference with non-target competitors, and, in a subclause that I believe is the single most unsettling phrase in the entire document, demonstrated intentionality. Demonstrated intentionality. As a judged criterion, in a tiebreaker, the document was asking an adjudication panel. There was an adjudication panel, 3 officials appointed by the governing authority, with defined terms and removal procedures, to evaluate whether a competitor had eliminated an opponent with sufficient deliberateness to deserve the distinction. Article 3 was the eligibility and registration section. It described the requirements for competing. There were several. Competitors were required to submit documentation of vehicle specifications for pre-competition inspection, to attend a mandatory safety briefing. I noted the word safety with a particular quality of feeling that I cannot fully describe, and to sign a document that the Charter called the Informed Consent Declaration. The Informed Consent Declaration was referenced, but not reproduced in full in the Charter. What was reproduced was its summary clause, stated that all competitors acknowledged participation as voluntary, acknowledged awareness of mortality risk as a condition of participation, and acknowledged that the governing body bore no liability for deaths occurring within the rules of competition. Voluntary participation with acknowledged mortality risk. Article 4 covered what the document called course management and staging. This article described the pre-competition procedures, the inspection of vehicles by officiating staff, the drawing of starting positions, briefing protocols. What I found notable about Article 4 was a subsection addressing competitor communications during the staging period. The subsection indicated that competitors were permitted to communicate with each other during pre-competition staging, specific restrictions on what could be discussed. The restrictions covered tactical information of a type that could constitute collusion, which the document defined and prohibited. The document was, in other words, not only governing the competition itself, but governing what competitors were and were not allowed to discuss beforehand. It had an anti-collusion rule, a document that assigned point premiums for contested lethal eliminations, also had a prohibition on anti-competitive conduct, and the two provisions sat in the same charter, ratified by the same governing authority, enforced by the same officiating body. Article 5 covered officiating standards. The adjudication panel was described in detail, their appointment process, their responsibilities during heats, their authority to make real-time rulings on contested calls, and their obligation to provide written reasoning for any ruling that affected point awards or standings. The written reasoning requirement was underlined in the translated exhibit by Peth Rall, who had added, in the small annotation notation she uses during reviews, the single word, mandatory. The officiating panel was required to explain its decisions in writing. Accountability. For the referees of a lethal competition, Article 6 covered appeals. I will summarize this article because it is long and procedurally detailed. Competitors had the right to appeal officiating decisions they believed were incorrect. The appeals process had defined timelines, defined evidentiary standards, and a defined appeals body separate from the original adjudication panel. The appeals body's decisions were final and binding. The article also specified that malicious or frivolous appeals filed in bad faith to delay or harass rather than to seek genuine remedy, were subject to sanctions. The appeals process was, in short, a real appeals process, designed not as a gesture, but as a functional mechanism for correcting errors and maintaining competitive integrity. Article 7 covered competitor conduct during and after heats, including provisions about what happened when a competitor was eliminated. Eliminated competitors were required, where physically capable of doing so, vacate the course in a manner that did not obstruct ongoing competition. The article also specified that eliminated competitors retained the right to file appeals under Article 6 even after elimination. Their exit from the competition did not forfeit their procedural rights. I read that subclause 3 times. The dead, or the soon-to-be dead, had procedural rights. I want to be precise about the analytical point here, because it's easy to read what I've scribed so far and conclude that the document is evidence of pathology, that the humans who produced it were aberrant, that this was a product of a broken or criminal system, that it represented the worst of what the species could produce, rather than anything systematically representative. I thought this too, approximately 3 minutes. Then I read Article 8. Article 8 was the sportsmanship code. I will reproduce the relevant passages from Article 8 translation, because they are important. Article 8, Section 1 stated, All competitors are expected to conduct themselves with professionalism throughout competition heats, including in interactions with opposing competitors during pre-heat staging, post-heat review, and any required contact under Article 10 dispute procedures. Article 8, Section 3 stated, deliberate interference with a competitor who has already been eliminated and is no longer a competitive factor is prohibited and subject to sanction under Article 11. Article 8, Section 5 stated, competitors are expected to acknowledge verified eliminations of opposing competitors with appropriate recognition of the opposing competitor's performance where conditions permit. Article 8, Section 7. And this is the one that I have thought about most. In the months since this review session, stated, no competitor shall engage in conduct calculated to cause distress to the family members or designated affiliates of an eliminated competitor. Disputes regarding the conduct of elimination or the circumstances of a competitor's death shall be handled through the Article 10 process, not through retaliatory action. I set the printed pages down on the station surface. A species that was building rules to govern the killing of each other in competition had also built rules to protect the families of the killed from harassment. The same document that established a point premium for a technically proficient vehicular homicide also established a procedure by which the family of the person who had been vehicularly homicided could file a dispute and have it reviewed by a 3-official panel. The document was internally consistent. The document was not the product of people who didn't care. The document was the product of people who cared a great deal, who had cared enough, and thought carefully enough, and argued with each other long enough to produce 12 articles of carefully articulated regulatory language governing a competition in which the competitors knew they would regularly die. I asked Isabel 7 to pause the transcript log. I sat in the consultations alcove for 22 minutes. The consultation alcove off Chamber Orval 3 is a small room, 6 paces by 4, a bench, a low work surface, a ventilation grid, 1 lighting panel. It is designed for the brief deliberations that sometimes arise during a hearing when one member of the panel needs to collect their thoughts before returning to the record. I had used it perhaps a dozen times in my career, always briefly. The longest I had previously spent there was 7 minutes during a hearing on a VethCon border species assessment that had produced an unexpected military intelligence disclosure. I spent 22 minutes in the alcove because I was engaged in a process I do not usually need in professional settings, which is the process of deciding whether the thing I had just read actually meant what I thought it meant, whether I had made an interpretive error that, if corrected, would resolve the discomfort I was feeling. I went through the interpretive alternatives carefully. The first was that the document was not what the Xenographic Office had described it as, that the term governing charter was a loose translation of something less formal, something more like a set of informal agreements among a small criminal subculture, rather than an actual regulatory instrument of a recognized authority. I had read enough of the document to know this was not a viable interpretation. The language was formal, the structure was formal, the ratification clause was formal. The document had the internal characteristics of a genuine administrative instrument, cross-references to other articles, defined terms used consistently throughout, procedural language that implied an institutional context. It was not informal. The second alternative was that the Federal Wasteland Administration was a fringe entity rather than an actual governmental body, that the governing authority language in the ratification clause was a claim that this organization made on its own behalf, but that was not recognized by any broader human governmental structure. This was a more viable alternative, and I held on to it for a few minutes. It would have meant that the charter was the product of a rogue or criminal element rather than a mainstream institution, which would have simplified the classification problem considerably. A species with fringe groups that produce elaborate governance frameworks for lethal competition is a very different animal from a species whose recognized governing bodies produce them. But the xenographic context worked against this interpretation. The Federal Wasteland Administration's broadcasts, the humans had been broadcasting extensively, as I noted, described it as a recognized territorial government with defined jurisdictional authority. Its communications were not clandestine. They circulated through the same open frequency channels as the human's other administrative communications. There was no indication, in any of the broadcast material the Xenographic Office had reviewed, that other human governance structures regarded the Federal Wasteland Administration as illegal or illegitimate. The third alternative was the one I was most reluctant to entertain, because it was the one that, if correct, was the most analytically consequential. That alternative was that the document meant exactly what it said, that the Federal Wasteland Administration was exactly what it described itself as, and that the humans had, as a matter of normal civilizational operation, produced and were actively maintaining a legitimate governmental framework for a lethal competition. I spent most of the 22 minutes in the alcove working through the implications of that third alternative. I kept returning to one particular implication, not the violence, not even the governance of the violence. The implication I kept returning to was the voluntariness, the informed consent declaration, the fact that the Charter took the voluntary nature of participation seriously enough to document it formally. The governing body had not drafted a document that conscripted competitors or compelled participation. It had drafted a document that described participation as a right that could be exercised after informed consent, and had built documentation of that consent into the regulatory architecture. A government that is regulating something it considers illegitimate doesn't build consent documentation into the regulatory architecture. You build consent documentation into a framework when you are trying to protect the right of participants to choose. The Federal Wasteland Administration was protecting the right of humans to choose to enter lethal competition, compelling them, protecting their choice. That was when I came back into the chamber and told Isabel 7 to resume the transcript log. When I came back, Peth Ral had flagged a section of the exhibit I had not yet reached, a set of supplementary materials appended to the main charter. She did this by highlighting the relevant portion on the chamber display without speaking, which is the Soric way of saying, I found something, and I think you need to see it before we continue the formal record. The supplementary materials included a document the Xenographic Office had labeled, in their processing notes, as Event Communication Fragment, Translation Confidence 91%. The Event Communication Fragment was a short document, approximately a full-page translation. The Xenographic notes indicated it appeared to be a written communication transmitted between a competitor or prospective competitor and the governing body's administrative office, recovered from the same data packet as the main charter, but clearly a separate document. I will reproduce the translation of this communication in full, because the translation confidence was high, and because the content is directly relevant to the classification question. The communication read, in translation, to the Registration Office, Sanction 7 Series. I'm writing to clarify a point from the current edition of the competition rules before I finalize my entry for Heat 3. Article 2, Section 4 specifies that vehicle eliminations achieve full point value only when the eliminated vehicle is confirmed non-operational, at the conclusion of the segment in which the elimination occurs. My question is whether a confirmed elimination in the final minutes of a segment where the non-operational status is established by official timing, but the eliminated vehicle has not been physically examined by the course officials before the segment ends, would still achieve full point value, or whether there would be a deduction. I ask, because in a recent qualifying event, I believed I had a confirmed elimination and received a partial point award instead, and the ruling was explained to me verbally, but I didn't receive written documentation of the applicable rule interpretation. I want to make sure I understand the standard before I commit to a tactical approach that relies on it. Thank you for your attention to this matter. It was signed with a name that I will not reproduce here because the xenographic rendering of human names is inconsistent, and this particular person is not the subject of the classification review. What matters is not the name. What matters is the tone. I had Isabel Sefson read the communication aloud into the record. I wanted the intonation captured. She read it in the flat, precise voice she uses for all exhibits, which was in this case exactly appropriate. The communication was professional. The communication was calm. The communication described a procedural question about point awards in a lethal competition with the same quality of mild bureaucratic conscientiousness that an athlete might bring to a query about officiating standards. There was no distress in it. There was no performance of danger or violence. There was a question about rule interpretation and a request for written documentation so that the writer could plan accordingly. The writer had, in a previous qualifying event, attempted to eliminate a competitor, had apparently succeeded, and had received a partial rather than full point award, and had not understood the applicable rule and had wanted to understand it correctly before committing to the same approach again. The communication was the kind of thing a professional sends when they want to do their job correctly. The competition was their job. Eliminating other competitors was a technical component of the job. Understanding the scoring criteria for that component was a professional concern. Pethral had not moved since Isabel 7 finished reading. I looked at her. She looked at me. She said, "I think we have a classification problem." I said, "Yes." We sat with that for a moment. The classification problem was this. The Concord Species Registry uses a taxonomy that had been developed over approximately 400 years of expansion and contact, and it was, I say this as someone who has worked within it for 31 years, a reasonably good taxonomy. It had been refined many times. It accounted for a wide range of species profiles, including profiles that had once seemed anomalous, but had eventually been accommodated by revising the relevant category definitions. It was not perfect, but it was functional. Entry 7441H did not fit cleanly into any existing category. Combat assessment data supported Category 6. Controlled contact with monitoring, on the basis of lethality profile, standard practice. Numerous species held Category 6 designations. What made Category 6 appropriate as a designation was the combination of high lethality with a file suggesting that the lethality was either environmentally conditioned, instinct-driven, or limited to specific conflict trigger contexts. The implication of Category 6 was approach with awareness of risk. The risk is real but bounded. With appropriate protocol, contact can be managed. The governing charter we had just reviewed did not support a bounded risk profile. A species that had produced a 12-article regulatory framework for lethal competition was not a species whose lethality was instinct-driven or environmentally conditioned. It was a species that had sat down collectively and decided to administer its own violence. That implied a degree of deliberate relationship with lethality that the Category 6 designation was not designed to accommodate. Category 8 existed for species whose lethality was assessed as deliberately cultivated, meaning the species had, as a civilization-level choice, invested in and developed its capacity for violence rather than simply expressed it as a biological feature. Category 8 carried a hard quarantine recommendation. It was rarely assigned. It was, in the history of the Concord's classification record, precursor to the 4 involuntary extinctions I mentioned at the beginning of this account. It was not a designation to assign lightly. Category 8 was also not quite right. Category 8 had been designed for species that treated their violence as an instrument, as a tool, domination, for territorial expansion, for the elimination of competitors. Profile it described was a species that killed, because killing served survival or power. The humans, based on the evidence before us, did not kill exclusively for those reasons. They also killed, had organized and governed the killing of, for reasons that the document itself described as competitive and sporting. The Federal Wasteland Administration had not established the Sanctioned 7 Death Race series to expand territory or dominate rivals. It had established it because there were humans who wanted to do this, and the governing body had decided that the appropriate response to that fact was to write rules. Category 8 said, this species deploys violence as a strategic instrument. What the evidence said about humans was something more complicated. This species deploys violence as a strategic instrument and also enjoys it sufficiently to have built a recreation industry around its structured expression and has applied to that recreational violence the same administrative rigor it applies to its legal systems and its trade frameworks and its governance structures. Because this species appears to apply administrative rigor to most things it does, including things that kill its own members at scale. We did not have a category for that, Pethral said after a long silence. I want to go back to the combat assessment. We went back to the combat assessment, specifically the subsection on intraspecies conflict mortality and the related subsection on population and civilizational continuity. These two subsections, together, contained a fact that I had noted on first reading, but had not examined closely because at the time, I had been reading them in the context of a standard Category 6 assessment, where the fact was notable, but not necessarily critical. In the context of the governing charter and the competition communication, the fact was critical. The fact was this: in the same historical period, during which human intraspecies conflict mortality had reached the figures I described earlier, figures that any species following a standard civilizational trajectory would indicate imminent systemic collapse. The humans had simultaneously expanded their institutional and administrative infrastructure, not despite the violence. During it, the governance structures, the coordination bodies, the legal frameworks, the trade systems, all of these had been developed and refined in parallel with the sustained large-scale killing. The species had not stopped to build institutions after the violence resolved. The species had built institutions while the violence was ongoing, apparently on the theory that the violence was going to continue for the foreseeable future, and it was therefore more efficient to develop the institutional architecture in parallel than to wait. The governing charter of the Sanction 7 Death Race series was not an aberration. It was an example of a general behavioral pattern. The humans built frameworks for everything, including the things they did to each other that other species would have classified as atrocities. The humans built frameworks. Dispute resolution, appeals processes, defined eligibility criteria, point tables, sportsmanship codes, protections for the families of the dead. I thought about the writer of the competition communication. I thought about the quality of the communication, the careful, professional, bureaucratically conscientious quality of a person who wants to understand the rules and follow them correctly. Thought about the fact that the rules they wanted to understand correctly governed a competition in which they expected to kill other people and possibly be killed. I thought about the fact that the communications tone was exactly the tone that any competent professional uses when clarifying procedural point before beginning an important project. The killing was the project. The rules were the rules of the project. Understanding the rules correctly was professional due diligence. I asked Isabel 7 to pull the full xenographic profile from the broadcast archive, broader survey of human institutional structures, not just the conflict data. I wanted to look at the governance frameworks more carefully. What she pulled was extensive. I am going to describe the relevant pattern rather than inventory the data, because the inventory would extend this record considerably, and the pattern is what matters. The humans had produced a large number of governance frameworks. In the period covered by the xenographic survey, the number of distinct governance systems operating concurrently on the human homeworld alone was. This was a number that required me to verify it, as well, over 100, with partial overlaps and nested jurisdictions and coordination mechanisms and treaty structures linking them. Over 100 concurrent governance systems for a single planetary population. The complexity of that structure would have been, for most species, evidence of a civilization on the verge of systemic failure. For the humans, it appeared to be standard operating procedure. Within that governance structure, the humans had produced legal codes governing almost every domain of human activity: property, commerce, violence, production, expression, movement. The legal codes were extensive and detailed and actively contested. The humans argued about their legal codes constantly, revised them regularly, and built parallel institutions specifically for the purpose of resolving disputes about how the codes should be interpreted. The humans had also, within that governance structure, produced a substantial body of what the xenographic survey labeled sanctioned competition frameworks, regulatory systems for competitive activities. The survey listed dozens of these. Some governed athletic competition of a non-lethal variety. Some governed commercial competition, governed various forms of conflict that had been formalized and regulated to reduce uncontrolled lethality. And some, not many, not zero, governed competitions in which lethality was not merely an accepted risk but a structured feature, as in the document we had reviewed. The sanctioned competition frameworks in the lethal category were not all equivalent to the sanctioned 7 death race series. Some were considerably more controlled, some involved considerably higher levels of lethality. The point was not the spectrum, the point was the consistency of the behavior. When humans decided to do something, including things that killed people, they built rules for it. The rules were real rules, with real enforcement mechanisms, real adjudication procedures, real appeal processes. The rules were not cosmetic, taken seriously. Violations of the rules were treated as meaningful violations, punishable, addressable, subject to formal remedy. A species that treats violations of its rules for lethal competition as meaningful violations, and has built institutions to address those violations, is a species whose relationship with governed violence is something we did not have a category for. Pethrall said, "I'm going to make a recommendation," I said. "I know what it is," she said. "We table it," I said. "We table it." Tabling a classification is not a common outcome. In 31 years I had tabled 2 prior cases, both involving species whose profiles generated genuine taxonomic ambiguity. Tabling does not mean the file is closed. It means the classification question is referred to a higher chamber for review, with a recommendation that the review body consider whether the existing category system requires expansion before a determination can be made. It is, in administrative terms, an admission that the current framework is not adequate to the case. I had never, before this session, tabled a case. For the reason I was about to write in the referral, I drafted the referral memo while Isabel 7 prepared the case archive. The memo was short. It described the 3 exhibits, summarized the relevant analytical tensions, the combat lethality profile, the deliberate adaptive rating, without observed ceiling, the governing charter, the competition communication, the institutional framework, and stated the panel's consensus conclusion, which was that entry 7, 441H presented a species profile that did not fit any existing classification category. Then I wrote the classification problem statement, which is the required element in any tabling referral. The classification problem statement is supposed to describe, in 1 or 2 sentences, core reason the panel cannot reach a determination. I wrote 6 drafts of the classification problem statement. I am going to reproduce the final version here, because I want the record to reflect what we actually concluded, not a softened administrative summary. The classification problem statement read, "The panel finds that entry 7, 11H presents a species whose lethality is both extensively documented and extensively governed by the species itself. The humans do not merely practice violence. They have developed and actively maintain regulatory infrastructure for its conduct, including mechanisms for participant consent, dispute resolution, and protections for third parties affected by violent outcomes. This combination, high lethality with high administrative investment in the governance of that lethality, does not correspond to any existing category, and the panel recommends that the higher chamber determine whether the correct response to A, expand the existing category system to accommodate this profile, or determine that a species capable of governing its own violence at this level, and this scale requires a designation, currently contemplated by the registry. I printed the referral, I signed it out, I sealed the case archive. Isabel 7 asked me, when I handed her the sealed file, whether I wanted to add a personal note to the administrative record. Sis. This is an option available to senior arbiters in cases where the arbiter believes the file contains material of particular significance for future viewers. I had used this option twice before. Both times the note was brief. I added a note. I will reproduce it here in full because it is the most accurate single thing I can say about entry 74441H. The note read, "The difficulty with this species is not that they fight. Many species fight. The difficulty is that they fight, and they know it. And they have decided that since they fight, the fighting should be done correctly. The word correctly is not mine. It is theirs. I found it in the sportsmanship code. That is not a statement any species in the Category 8 column has ever made. Category 8 species do not write sportsmanship codes. They do not establish protections for the families of the killed. They do not send professional correspondence asking for written clarification of the applicable point award standards. The higher chamber should be aware that this species has, somewhere in its institutional history, looked at the worst things it does and decided to administer them. Whatever category we eventually assign them, that fact should inform it. I sealed the note. I initialed the file. I handed it to Isabel 7 for archiving. The session formally closed at the 14th hour of the station clock. Stayed in Chamber Orval 3 for a time after Pethral and Isabel 7 had gone. I'm not sure exactly how long. Long enough for the overhead panels to cycle through one full lighting adjustment. I sat at the senior arbiter's station, and I did not read anything, and I did not draft anything. I thought about the writer of the competition communication. I thought about a person who had entered a lethal competition voluntarily, who had in a previous heat attempted and apparently achieved the elimination of a competing participant who had received a partial point award rather than the full award they believed was correct, and who had responded to this by writing a professional letter requesting clarification of the applicable rule interpretation, specifically because they wanted to understand the standard correctly before committing to the same tactical approach again. I thought about the quality of mind required to write that letter. Not the cruelty of it. I want to be clear about this. What struck me was not the violence, not the willingness to kill or be killed. What struck me was the professionalism, the competence, the genuine bureaucratic conscientiousness of a person who wanted to do something correctly and understood that doing it correctly required understanding the rules, and that understanding the rules required asking for clarification. The person who wrote that letter was not a monster. They were, by the evidence of the letter itself, a professional with standards. Those standards happened to include the correct execution of lethal competitive elimination. But the standards were there. The commitment to correctness was there. The relationship to rules, the genuine respect for rules as meaningful structures rather than obstacles to be ignored, that was there too. That is what we did not have a category for. Not the violence, not the killing, the relationship to governance. The fact that the killing and the governance were for them not opposites, not intention. The same person who wanted to make sure they understood the point award criteria was also, presumably, person who participated in the appeals process under Article 10 if they believed a ruling had been applied incorrectly to them. The same civilization that established the sportsmanship code had also established the informed consent declaration. They had thought about all of it. They had put it in writing. They had ratified it. I have been in this work for 31 years, and I have reviewed 412 species. I have learned that species are, in the aggregate, what their worst behaviors suggest. Not because the worst behaviors represent the entirety of what a species is, but because the worst behaviors are where you see what a species is willing to do when resources, power, or survival are at stake. The question the classification process asks ultimately is, what does this species do when it decides it can? What the humans apparently decided they could do, they had built a governance framework to do correctly. I left the chamber at the 16th hour and filed the referral with the higher chamber intake office. 3 weeks later, I received an acknowledgement from the higher chamber, which indicated that the entry 7, 441H referral had been logged and assigned a review docket. The expected review timeline, the acknowledgement said, was 12 to 18 months. 14 months later, I received a communication from the higher chamber indicating that the review had been escalated from a standard 3-arbiter panel to a full 12-arbiter chamber session, and that the expected timeline had been extended by an unspecified period. That was 7 months ago. The file is still open. I am told the debate in the higher chamber has been substantive. I believe it. I am told that one of the early analytical questions the chamber had to address was whether the Sanction 7 death race series was representative, broader human behavioral patterns, or was better understood as an outlier, a product of specific territorial and resource conditions, rather than a generalizable civilizational trait. I understand they pulled additional xenographic data to address this question. I understand the additional data did not simplify the analysis. It was, I'm told, consistent with the pattern we had observed. Wherever the humans faced a domain of behavior that generated significant mortality, they eventually built an administrative framework for it, and the framework was generally serious, with real dispute mechanisms, real enforcement, real appeals. I have heard, through the informal chancels that exist in any large administrative body, treason, that the Chamber is now debating whether the classification problem with entry 741H requires not just a new category but a new axis on the classification taxonomy itself, a dimension that has not previously been used because no prior species had required it, which would measure not lethality in isolation but what one of the Chamber arbiters apparently called, in a working session, administered lethality. The capacity of a species to be highly lethal and highly organized about the lethality simultaneously. Not one or the other, both. I don't know whether that axis will be added. That's for the higher chamber to decide. What I know is what I read in Chamber Orval 3 on the morning I have described. The 12 articles of the governing charter, the sportsmanship code, the communication from the competitor who wanted to understand the point award criteria correctly. I know that somewhere in the outer arm of this galaxy's primary spiraling structure, there is a planet called Earth, orbiting a yellow star designated Sol, and on that planet, there are several billion individuals of a species that has, by any measurable metric, an extraordinary capacity for organized violence. I know that the same species looked at that capacity and wrote rules for it. I know that the rules were serious, that they were enforced, that violations were treated as violations, that there were protections for the families of the dead. I know that the person who wrote the competition communication was, in the estimation of the document itself, a legitimate participant in a legitimately sanctioned activity, exercising their legitimate right to seek clarification of the applicable standards so that they could perform their work correctly. I don't know what category we will eventually put them in. I suspect the debate in the higher chamber will continue for some time. I know that when it concludes, whatever designation is assigned, whoever reads the entry 7041H file afterward, any arbiter, any assessor, any deemed species representative who opens the archive and reads through the exhibits, in order, they will reach Exhibit B, the governing charter, 12 articles, the point tables, the adjudication panel with its defined terms and removal procedures, the informed consent declaration, the sportsmanship code, the protections for families, and then they will reach the competition communication, the carefully professional inquiry about point award standards, the mild bureaucratic conscientiousness, the desire to enter rules correctly before committing to a tactical approach. And I believe that when they reach that communication, they will sit very still for a moment, the way Pethral sat very still, the way I sat very still, and they will understand exactly why the file is still open. The killing we could have classified. It was the scoreboard that stopped us.